Okay, here we are with the last section for the Civil War here for Chapter 17, the war's final stages. So we're past the turning points. We're in the towards the end, the last year and a half of fighting or so. 1864, a lot of Union victories, and 1865 is the surrender of the Confederacy. So we're going to evaluate the idea of total war and how it affected the South, because the fact that the Union could have more of a total war economy compared to the South really influenced things, and we're going to identify and analyze the events that ended the Civil War. So, all right, so the Union is starting to close in. In March of 1864, Grant was given command of all Union armies. They moved towards Richmond, and then William Tecumseh Sherman led deep attacks in the South. Grant takes charge. President Lincoln liked that Grant was a man of action. Now that he was in charge, Grant wasted little time coming up with a plan to finish the war. He would deliver blows on all sides, and he wanted to move towards Richmond because that was the capital of the Confederacy. Now you might be asking yourself, why would the Confederacy put their capital in Virginia, in Richmond, and then the Union capitals in D.C.? Those are like right next to each other. So that's just something to kind of think about. Grant attacked Petersburg, cutting off troops and supplies from Confederates, and the Union Navy blockaded Mobile Bay in Alabama. And yes, it's Mobile, not mobile. So, anyway, May and June of 1864, the Union confronts a lot of the smaller forces of the Confederates, and they just try to keep moving. There's a lot of trees between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia. And on May 5th, 1864, the 6 bloodiest weeks of the war began. So towards the end was actually the worst, because there was so much fighting. The South was getting desperate, so they were trying to do anything that they could to get there, to take over. For example, in a space of 30 days, Grant lost 50,000 of his troops, and his critics called him the Butcher. But Lincoln stood by the general, and it was good that he kept fighting. The Union kept making progress throughout this time, and they get to Petersburg, which was an important railroad center that was vital to move troops and supplies for the Confederacy. Once he takes that, Richmond would be cut off from the rest of the Confederacy, and that was a good thing. Okay. Now, Lincoln won re-election in 1864. And in 1865, Congress banned slavery by passing the 13th Amendment. I talked about that a couple sections ago. But yeah, Lincoln gets re-elected in 1864, and he is assassinated not long after that, but we'll get to that. All right, now, these are important commanders of the Civil War. Okay, for the Union, obviously you have Ulysses S. Grant. He is the top general of the Union Army. William Tecumseh Sherman, he was important in the South, especially in Georgia. We'll talk about his march to the sea and how that was important. And then you have David Farragut. He was the highest ranking officer in the Union Navy. He was actually half Spanish. He joined the Navy when he was only 12. And he was very good on the sea. He led the U.S. Navy to some of its greatest victories in the Civil War. So he was the top Navy guy. So just make sure you distinguish that. Grant and Sherman were Army. Farragut was Navy. Now the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee. Okay, he's kind of the top guy there. John Hood. He's just another. He's kind of like parallel to Sherman a little bit. And then Joseph Finnegan would be similar to Farragut. Both kind of the same there. Um, yeah, so okay, Sherman here. So Sherman's March to the Sea. Uh, just some background about him. He attended West Point Military Academy and graduated in 1840. He worked in California as an administrative officer during the Mexican War and did not fight in any battles. So he, unlike Grant and Lee, Sherman, Tecumseh is a famous Native American. Uh, anyway, that's neither here nor there. Sherman, he never actually fought in any battles during this war. He resigned from the Army in 1853 and worked for a bank in San Francisco. After several business disappointments, he became a superintendent of the military academy in Louisiana. So he kind of follows the same path as Grant, where he leaves the Army, then kind of gets slowly roped back in to doing it again. When Louisiana seceded from the Union, Sherman left the South and moved to the North. He didn't have the same beliefs, so he moves to the North, and that ended up being a very critical move, actually, in the long run. So, in 1861, with the help of his brother, Senator John Sherman, he obtained a position as a colonel in the U.S. Army. So, right at the beginning of the war, he was a colonel, and he worked his way up to general. All right, so more about him here. He rose through the ranks, and under the command of General Grant, he established himself as a strong leader in the Battle of Shiloh. If you remember that one that's at the beginning. After the battle, he was promoted to Major General. Very, very good general. He fought alongside Grant at the Battle of Vicksburg, which was a turning point, remember? And together they led the Union armies in many important victories. If you don't know about Vicksburg, that was in the last section, and if you should go back and probably read the PowerPoint. That's got some good stuff on there about Vicksburg and Gettysburg. As the Union armies continued to engulf Confederate troops, Sherman led his troops on a march to the sea. So what he does is he goes through and he just tries to take everything that he can, going along the East Coast all the way down through Georgia. Sherman reached Savannah and presented the city to President Lincoln. Sherman continued his march through the Carolinas, joined Grant's forces near Richmond. Union troops took food, tore up railroad lines and fields, killed livestock. And Sherman's march was part of a strategy that was total war. So total war involves not only targeting enemy's army, but also its land and people. Sherman hoped to bring the horrors of war to the southern population so he could help end the war. So a total war is when you don't just go after soldiers, you actually go after the land and civilians too. You're trying to just wipe out and devastate the whole region. So he was doing that. Sherman, like if you go like to Georgia, it's not a very well liked thing to talk about with Sherman and his march to the sea. Still kind of a sensitive topic there. After the war, he became a lieutenant general and later commanding general of the army. So he was very successful and had a very good military career during his lifetime. Now, before we get into this, while all this is happening with Sherman, Grant um, continues his siege on Petersburg, and then now they're going to try to move towards Richmond. Okay. Uh, Jefferson Davis and his cabinet prepared to leave. Jefferson Davis, remember, is the president of the Confederate States. They gathered their documents and leave, and bring any weapons that would be useful. And any weapons useful to the enemy were burned. Then they fled the city. The armory, where all the bullets and ammunition and stuff was stored, exploded. There was a lot of fires that broke out. On April 3rd, President Lincoln visited the captured town of Petersburg. And then his son, Tad, and a group of military officials arrived in Richmond on April 4th to tour the fallen Confederate capital. As Lincoln walked through the streets, joyful African Americans followed, singing, laughing, and reaching out to touch the president. They were very grateful for what had happened. Jefferson Davis, Lincoln went to his house and sat in the chair where his Jefferson Davis was sitting. He visited a couple prisons. Then he put into question what they should do with the Confederates, and things like that. So the war at this point is pretty much over. I mean, we've captured the capital. The Union's captured the capital. It's over. There's not really, once you have the capital, people give in pretty quick. So Sherman, General and Sherman combined, German, burned much of Atlanta to break the South's will. Along his march to the sea, he burned other cities and crops. Talked about that. That's total war. Talked about this. Withdrew from Petersburg. Union Army marched towards Richmond. Jefferson Davis and his cabinet fled the city. Got that. Okay, now the end. Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox, Virginia on April 9th, 1865. It's Appomattox Courthouse. Appomattox. I could never pronounce that right. The courthouse where he surrendered. Remember, it was an unconditional surrender. So it was just, okay, yep, we give up. And that was that. The Civil War was America's deadliest war, obviously, because everyone that was fighting in this war was American. So, just to give you some numbers here, the Civil War, number of American deaths, 620,000. World War II, 407,000. World War I, 107,000. Vietnam, 58,000. Korea, 35,500. The Revolution, 25,000. The Mexican War, 13,000. And, yeah, so just to give you a comparison there. Over 500,000 people died. Okay, now some outcomes of the war. So, casualties, remembers, death, wounded, MIA, prisoners of war. So total for the Union was 634,703 Union casualties during this time. 483,000 Confederate casualties, 258,000 deaths, 225,000 wounded. So casualties is over a million. Over a million. That's 1 point, let's see, it's 7, 1, 1. So 1.1 million casualties. Many public structures, homes, farms, and railroad tracks in southern cities were destroyed, which is the result of the total war. The war cost billions of dollars and left many in debt. The South was so far in debt that when Lincoln was coming up with a plan to how to allow them back into the Union, he was trying to make a plan for them to pay off all their debts, but that's not going to happen because of the next president. But anyway, the Union was saved and the federal government was actually strengthened. Many questions do remain. Oops. But slavery is over. But how to enforce that was a question. Millions of African Americans were free, but no one knew how to bring the southern states back into the Union, what the status of African Americans would be in the South, and Americans would struggle to answer these questions in the years ahead in an era that's known as Reconstruction, because we've been separated as a country, so now we have to become whole again. So it's just an interesting time. Reconstruction, generally, it's agreed upon that Reconstruction lasts from 1865 until 1877. So, because you have to go through a few different presidents there. Lincoln will be shot and assassinated in 1865. Andrew Johnson will take over. If you know anything about history or remember anything about recent history, Johnson was the first president to be impeached. He was one vote away from being removed in the Senate. The House impeached him, but the Senate didn't. He was an absolutely terrible president, but that's neither here nor there. Then you have to go through, Grant. He eventually becomes the president. Ulysses S. Grant, but he is corrupt as all can be. And fun fact, Ulysses S. Grant is on the what's he on, the $50 bill, right? So anyway, that's a little fun fact there. So all right, so that's the Civil War. This isn't generally talked about a lot, surprisingly, in a lot of classes in a lot of high schools and stuff. So it's important to know this era in history, this 4 years. A lot of tensions, a lot of things happen. It's an interesting time in American history, but hopefully you learned a thing or two and appreciate the Civil War a little bit more than you did before. And if you didn't appreciate it at all, hopefully you appreciate it a little bit now. So anyway.